My guest today has worked with everybody from Future, Young Thug, Snoop Dogg, CeeLo Green, everybody in between. One of the best mixing engineers I know, Amond AJ Jackson. Don't y'all go anywhere. Hey, yo, what's going on? It's Ruslan with KingsDreamENT.com, encouraging, empowering, inspiring you to live out God's dream for your life. We cover all kinds of different topics on this channel, and one of the ones that's most practical, is how to make your art, how to make your music better. And so today, a big chunk of music has to do with the way the music is mixed, the way it's blended, the way it's packaged sonically. And I thought, who better to have on this than my man Amond AJ Jackson. What's up, brother?
Man, I'm so excited to sit down with you, bro. How you been?
I've been fantastic. Thank you for letting us use your studio. We've been here for hours. We had Windy Day here, Brandman Sean, a bunch of content in Atlanta. I'm super grateful for being here. So you've been engineering for a while, what, at least a decade, right? Yeah,
more than a decade. I started in production and eventually moved my way into engineering. I found out at some point realized that it was my calling, and it's the thing I get the most pleasure out of.
Mixing the records, like taking something from kind of like a unfinished, unrefined piece of rock and refining it until it becomes a diamond, basically. That's how you think a fair illustration for mixing? Yeah,
for sure, man. I think that mixing, when I was a producer, I spent 90% of my time trying to find sounds and manipulate sounds. So it's like 90% digging, you know? And now I'm in a place where the best producers in the world and the best artists in the world are spending their 90% of their time finding sounds and then giving me the best that they have discovered, you know what I mean? And then asking me to elevate what they've created. And there's a massive benefit. I can do way more for people as a person that helps to create the vision that lives inside of somebody's spirit or their mind, and help them bring that to fruition a lot more than I ever could as a producer.
So you feel like in the engineer side, the mixer side, you're able to help people essentially get their vision clear, like refine their vision. You feel like the skill set you have is more suited towards mixing than it was for production.
Yeah, production didn't see. The thing was, I was always in love with sound. I was never really in love with producing. And so now that things operate this way, it feels more like me. I feel more in my own skin, and I just have more fun than I've ever had before.
That's dope. Now, there's a lot of music coming out, and we talked about it earlier. A lot of artists, I feel like, either are rushing stuff or just don't have, I don't know if they don't have the respect for the mix, or like what's going on. Like, we named off a couple artists. Specifically, I've been talking a lot about, I think one of the reasons why Chance's album didn't do as well is because it just wasn't mixed good. We kind of skimmed through it. What were your impressions of The Big Day?
Well, I mean, we didn't have a lot of time to check it out. The downside of being a mixer is that I don't get to spend a lot of time listening to music for leisure. So there are albums that I miss out on, like, you know, Chance's album. So we sat down, we listened to a few of them. What it sounded like was a lot of things were kind of incoherent or inconsistent. So I understand through conversation that there were a lot of different mix engineers involved, and a lot of different tracking engineers involved. And at that point, you need to have a chief engineer that kind of watches and polices the mixes, to make sure that the album feels cohesive, instead of just dumping all that on the mastering engineer and expecting them to get all these different pieces to
sound good. Yeah,
right. Sound good together. Like, it's to have context together. You know what I mean? Like albums are very different than singles, which that's a whole other conversation. But albums are very different than singles, and if you're going to do an album, then that album should sound like it captures a time period, and the songs should feel like they, on some level, belong together, even if they don't sonically sound the same. I don't believe in that, but them sonically sounding like they work together.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? To complete a thought.
Right.
You know?
Do you think that engineers who are partnered with an artist, right? So I think of 40, is 40 the main engineer with Drake, or is he just doing a production? Okay. Yeah. So 40's mixing too.
Right.
And I think of Kendrick and oh my gosh. Ali.
What up, Ali?
Excuse me. My bad, Ali. I've seen Ali mix in person before, which has been incredible. How does the ball seem to sometimes get dropped in those situations? Like you talked about some Drake mixes that you heard, and I heard the Damn album, and I thought that there's some stuff on there that just sounded kind of thrown together. How does that happen when there's an engineer alongside? Because you said with Chance, a lot of engineers, a lot of, hands in the pot. How does that happen when there's an actual engineer there that's, you know what I mean, at the hip of the artist essentially? Yeah,
without a doubt. So I think there's a lot of different things that come into play. Like one, professional artists typically don't say, hey, I'm going to do an album. Professional artists typically just create, and then they find a way to corral all of these different songs into an album. And I think that's the healthiest way of doing it. I think sitting down and saying, hey, I'm going to do an album is not, it's kind of, I don't know, it feels like you're forcing, every time I've seen that happen, it's like you're forcing something to go in a particular direction, and I don't think that that's the best way to do it. I think just being creative and letting it all out, and then finding ways of, how would I say that? Things that relate to one another in order to, like I said, like complete a thought. Right. So I think that happens, and so when you have different circumstances, like if somebody's touring, they do a collab, they fly into Miami for a weekend and they do a collab with somebody or any of that kind of stuff. You're recording in different places. You don't have one producer, which is another element. The production, most of the time when there's an issue in vocals that is not that is really difficult to fix, most of the time that's in the instrumentation and not in the vocal itself. Okay. So when you have producers from all over the place sending different levels of quality, and you're rocking to them based on the emotion and just trying to be creative, that also poses a problem. And then there's also, ultimately like deadlines, which are a very real thing. When you're 100% independent, you may not have a label at your back about holding a gun to your back about a deadline, but you got to eat too, and so that creates its own deadline. Right. And you don't want to fall out of rhythm with the fans, because if you're not releasing enough content, then your fans can kind of drift in another direction, and you can, kind of like lose touch with them. So deadlines still play a role. So I think when you start, now you're planning a tour before the album drops. You're doing,
that's the worst.
You know what I'm saying?
That's the worst. The biggest mistake you can make.
Right. You're shooting videos before the songs are mixed. That kind of stuff happens. So being an engineer is an awesome responsibility, whether you're dedicated to a particular thing, like you said, like my guy Ali, or Alex Toomey with Thug, or whatever. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's an awesome responsibility, and you carry a lot of weight on your shoulders, because you want to let the artist have fun and be themselves and be creative, and not kind of be like, hey, the tech police. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to be the tech police. You want to like try to manage the quality of the recordings and the production, but you can only do that so much before you start removing their ability to be free, and their ability to be free is what people connect to.
And it almost sounds like what you're kind of getting at from a tech standpoint is that different rooms, different microphones, the different recording engineer, obviously different studios, all of those play into how the finished product is going to come out. And you're saying, well, artist might be on the road, he might be flying in and out, he might cut a record in Miami, then go do a record in New York, right? So he might be moving around, and you're saying like all of that can actually impact when it comes time to mix the records.
Oh yeah, that and the biggest one to me is the production. I think the recordings themselves are typically in masterful hands. They're typically manageable, typically manageable. But the instrumentals are huge. Okay. And I work with a ton of producers. I probably mix for more producers than I do artists. Okay. And that production is a huge deal. Not having the right sound selection or not understanding the relationships between the instruments. Sometimes records it's just pure feel. An instrumental may just grab an artist and they have something on their heart at the time, and that instrumental works for it, whether it's well executed or not. As a composition, it doesn't. If they connect to the song, then the song gets tracked. At least, hopefully, the song gets tracked, so they can get that emotion out and you know, express themselves.
'Cause we in the mix, isn't it? Wait, I can't keep you in check, so tell your mama about the tattoos up to your neck. Go wear a collar if it goes with the burgundy kids, and tell your father that your night out wasn't the best from what I see via text.